Good evening, everyone. I'm Bano Murtuja, and
hello, and I'm Waqas, Tufail.
We're the co-authors of the report, and we're going to be taking you through the report, but in a summarised version. So we're really going to focus on some of the core quotes that came out and allow you to have the luxury of taking home the report and spending much more time with it and with the very, very rich data that we managed to get. To tell you a little bit about why the report came about, the project aimed to examine Prevent through the views and experiences of young British Muslims specifically between the ages of 18 to 25 and stakeholders with experience of Prevent. So stakeholders included everybody from teachers to activists to people that had actually been working in Prevent and had taken Prevent funding. We also reached out to government ministers, we reached out to members of the police force, we reached out to Prevent officers themselves, and actually many of the formal organisations, such as government ministers, either failed to respond, or where they did, actually declined, in the case of the police officer, actually declined to be involved in the research, recognising that whilst it was very important, he couldn't be involved in research on Prevent, which for us is kind of endemic of some of the problems that Prevent as a strategy faces. 36 interviews were carried out. They were in-depth, semi-structured interviews, and we also did a review of the existing literature, and in particular we were very keen to focus on the grassroots voices that are marginalised but also significantly impacted by Prevent. The report is influenced by the commitment that we have as an organisation to human rights, racial justice and civil liberties.
Thank you, Bano. So, just in terms of summarising some of the key aims, because again, we don't have a chance to go through all of the aims in detail, but we wanted to provide a voice for young people, in particular, who have been targeted or impacted by the Prevent agenda, because quite often we have the debate that is dominated by politicians, by academics, like me, and it's young people who are impacted by it, who don't really get their say, who don't really get their narratives, their stories across. So that was quite crucial to us in terms of making sense of their experiences. And we also wanted to give a voice to the range of viewpoints relating to the Prevent agenda, including dissenting views, which are often marginalised in public debate. And that's something that we're going to examine in this presentation in more detail, but it is covered in much more detail in the reports that you have on your tables, where there's this kind of a continuous government attack on critics of Prevent, and we think that says something about the Prevent strategy itself. And we also wanted to examine the views of young people and stakeholders in the aftermath of the implementation of the Counter-Terrorism and Security Act. And I know that I'm now citing the law, and I don't want to go down there because everyone's hungry and it's the evening and everything. But the Counter-Terrorism and Security Act is important because it placed the Prevent duty on illegal footing, which means that individuals like myself, I'm a university lecturer too, and school teachers, college lecturers are now legally obliged to have due regard to the Prevent duty in the undertaking of their duties. So our report is one of the first insights into the impact of the Counter-Terrorism and Security Act, so I think it's quite timely in that respect as well. And finally, in terms of the summary of the main aims, we also want to understand the role of race, faith and ethnicity in the context of the Prevent agenda, because we believe again that this is often overlooked. And this is something that government ministers in particular are not too keen to talk about, because there's one major faith involved really in terms of where the impact lies, and we'll be talking about that much more in the context of this presentation.
So, as we said, we're going to be summarising, so we did select some of the sections specifically to speak about. Now, Prevent has been widely criticised almost since its inception, for disproportionately focusing on and problematising British Muslims. Now, this is something that our respondents over and over again spoke about. We had numerous instances of our respondents providing examples of where Prevent had effectively allowed public sector agents, public sector workers operate in a fashion that really demonstrated the embedding of Islamophobia. It made banal items or banal expressions of the Muslim faith indicators of radicalization. The change of a young student going from not praying to now praying regularly as something that they had chosen to do, as somehow a suspect, as making them somehow suspect of moving into radicalization. Moreover, we had members we had respondents who spoke about almost this this notion that, well, we're going to look at radical far-right extremism, but actually, in reality, we had one of our respondents say, I contacted a school about training, and the school turned around and said, we don't have a problem with terrorism because we don't have any Muslim students. And that was literally, it was as blatant as that. And these are teachers in schools, and these are teachers that are being provided training over and over again. So what we were finding from what our respondents were telling us was that Islamophobia was literally being embedded into public sector, and on top of that was actually being used as a measurement of success of the activities of that public sector. So for example, schools are now being measured in terms of their Ofsted rating as to how many referrals they have given. Now, on top of embedding Islamophobia and the suspectification of Muslims in the public sphere, we also found that many of the activists that we looked at were saying that there was a proactive demonization of people who were wanting to challenge Prevent. There was a complete lack of willingness to engage with even the debate that Prevent may well be harmful. And in fact, as opposed to engaging with the debate, there then came to be a demonization and a delegitimization of people through a good Muslim, bad Muslim narrative. And those were terms that our respondents often used. You have ideas of these people are the good Muslims because they toe the line, and they say the right thing, and they give in wherever they need to give in. And these folk are going to be the bad Muslims because they take a stand and they say, well, actually, there's nothing wrong with praying 5 times a day, for example. Although those are my words, not the respondents, I should say that. This led specifically to recommendation, which is one of our recommendations, 5, which is for the government to cease the divisive and discriminatory practices of embedding counter-terrorism aims and objectives within social policy programmes aimed at British Muslims, particularly in the area of integration and through the discourse of British values.
Okay, so these were 2 key themes in terms of our report: surveillance and censorship. And I'm going to focus on the example of higher education because we spoke to many individuals who worked in higher education or studied in higher education as students, and it did come across as a major theme in terms of the experiences, particularly of Muslims. So just to give one example, we had a Muslim student who was working, I think, as part of the Islamic Society, and there was a campus-based Prevent officer who had asked this individual to supply the lists of Muslim students who were attending these events. So there's this kind of quite blatant disregard for privacy. There's a quite blatant disregard for the ability to organise events without disruption, and also there's a kind of fear of interference from the state. And that was just one experience. In terms of some of the other experiences that were mentioned in our report by our respondents, they relate to some, I guess if you research it or if you read about it, you may be familiar with some of the instances, but there were 2 academic conferences that were cancelled that were based on Prevent and Islamophobia. There was one at Birkbeck at the University of London in 2015, I think, and there was one at the University of Huddersfield in 2016. And these events were cancelled on the back, at least in part, of pressure by Prevent officers. I was actually invited to speak at the University of Huddersfield conference. I declined because I was flying to Australia the next day. But then I heard about it when I got back that actually it didn't take place. And now it's come about through other reports that actually Prevent officers played a part in encouraging the university, to close those events down. So this is 2017, this is Britain, and if we're talking about democracy and fundamental rights, I think that we have to begin to question, this kind of policing culture that is now bleeding in to our higher education system. And that's actually one of the quotes that our respondents gave where he spoke, and this is a Muslim academic, where he spoke about a policing culture now becoming apparent in higher education. And students are thinking twice about the essay questions they choose, about the comments and questions they make in class, for fear of being placed under suspicion. I mean, is this the kind of environment that you want to send your kids in? I mean, it's certainly not the environment that I want to teach in. So I think that these are some of the main questions that came up. I mean, I can talk about my own experience, but I'm not going to bore you with that too much. But I will say that as an academic, I have had Muslim students who have come up to me and said that they are unwilling to contribute in class on certain topics for fear of being seen, as potentially extremist or potentially radical in their views. So this was a major theme in our report, surveillance and censorship, and I'm going to come back to it in the recommendations later on. Okay, so it's me again, talking about austerity and youth services. So as everyone here is well aware, the previous coalition government and the current Conservative governments have pressed ahead with austerity, which I guess is a depoliticised term that means taking money from public services, which is in effect, what has taken place. And the political justification is that this is to balance the books, that New Labour spent too much, and what we've seen is that there's been a real impact on youth services, and that was something that our respondents really picked up on, because a number of our respondents work in areas such as the youth service. Some of them have actually taken money from Prevent in the past, some of them are charity workers, and there's a couple of issues there where some of our respondents say that if you are a BME charity, for example, and you want to do some positive work, it is so difficult to get funding, and the funding that is available is normally available under the guise of Prevent, because the government have, quite literally hundreds of millions of pounds that they have spent on Prevent since its inception. But then, of course, if you take that money, you have to kind of coalesce with the government's aims and objectives in relation to counter-terrorism. So there's this kind of idea where we want to do positive work with young people, but it's just not available, where we don't have funding and that isn't tainted by counter-terrorism. Moreover, it's had a real impact on young people, because I think that it's a bit of a misnomer anyway, because of course when we talk about terrorism, some of the most recent terrorists, if you think about the London attacks were committed by people who were not young. The guy who was the terrorist at Finsbury Park Mosque was not young, right? This was the far right white extremist. But I think that it's important to consider that there's been this recognition on the ground from grassroots frontline employees that there is an issue where there is no scope or potential for those interventions with young people, and particularly in the most deprived communities. And the money that is available is unfortunately under the guise of counter-terrorism, and I'm going to come back onto that as well again later in the recommendations.
So that brings us really nicely onto accountability, because one of the things that the respondents spoke about quite a lot was the fact that there was this complete culture of secrecy surrounding Prevent. There was a lack of transparency and very limited accountability, if any at all, in fact, in terms of the implementation of the Prevent strategy. Now, respondents spoke often about the fact that people in Prevent, government agencies, will often speak about the successes. Prevent is very successful, but without giving any real evidentiary basis as to what that success is, without ever really speaking to what it means to have successful counter-radicalization of young people, whatever that may mean, because actually often they would also not provide definitions of what it means to even be an extremist or be radicalized per se. Now, one of the things that respondents did also note was that if Prevent had been so successful, why are we on 3 years of high terror? Why? Why, if Prevent is so successful, were the people that carried out the recent terror attacks, 3 of the 4 in Manchester and London, 3 of the 4 were known to counter-security agencies. And they were known because they had been reported by the Muslim community, often family members, in one instance, a mother. In fact, one of them had actually undertaken, both him and his brother, had undergone Prevent, apparently, but not very successfully. So what respondents were saying to us is not only is there no accountability, but we are constantly hearing this notion that no, Prevent is very, very successful, without any evidentiary basis for it. And it's very funny that they should say that, and then the Securities Minister this morning, in response to this report, should, in The Guardian, say, Prevent has been really successful and just doesn't know what it's talking about. I'm paraphrasing. But if the Securities Minister is doing that, for us, it's literally symptomatic of the problem that the respondents were talking about, where they were saying that voices that are actually trying to engage in debate and challenge are simply delegitimized with no substantive engagement with the actual issues that Prevent has. And there was no attempt to engage with the content of our report this morning by the Securities Minister. But the Minister himself did deign to talk about Just as an organisation. So that really tells us a great deal about what is and is not being valued in terms of the Prevent agenda, and the really affirms a great deal what our respondents were saying. It is also the reason that we recommended in our report very specifically that for the government that needs to release all details of all projects funded through counter-terrorism in order to allow full and transparent public scrutiny, and specifically that this information should include all costs associated with funded projects, the demographic information of those subject to the projects, details on how success was determined, and any subsequent evaluations that have been undertaken.
Okay, but the picture's not all that grim, okay, so bear with me, okay?
We're here.
Yeah. So I think that it's important to consider that there is resistance to Prevent, and I think that if we had a list of all the organisations or people that had condemned Prevent, that list would be greater than the guest list for an Asian wedding. I mean, you know, I'm talking about literally in the hundreds here. So, I mean, I guess that you're all familiar, or if you're not familiar, Prevent has been condemned by Rights Watch UK, by the Open Society Foundations, by the United Nations, by the National Union of Teachers, by the National Union of Students, by my union, the Universities and Colleges Union. So I think that part of the picture is that when the government ministers condemn, or I mean, because they tried to condemn our report today, it's easy for them to condemn if it's just an individual, if it's just an isolated instance of one report, but they can't ignore a whole body of evidence. And I think that is what Just has got in its favour, and that's what progressives have in their favour in terms of dealing with Prevent. Okay, so just in terms of recommendations, and these are just a snapshot of the recommendations, but these are the ones that I've had to answer to today in the press, where I've been on with the BBC and ITV, and they've been asking me these questions, so it's fresh in my mind. I think that they're the most important, so we'll talk about them. So our major recommendation is that the Prevent aspect of the government's counter-terrorism strategy needs to be withdrawn immediately because it causes human rights abuses, and because it's discriminatory, and because it's not fit for purpose, and also we could go further and say it's counterproductive. Okay, so that is our major recommendation there, and there's been quite a lot of interest in that. But that is the same position as, for example, the Liberal Democrats, who call for that same course of action. And we're also calling for a full and independent inquiry that hears evidence from a range of bodies, including human rights organisations, charities, third sector organisations, into the entire government counter-terrorism strategy. Finally, we also ask for the government to cease the divisive and discriminatory practice of embedding counter-terrorism aims and objectives within social policy programmes aimed at British Muslims. And we've not had too much chance to go into this in terms of this presentation, but quite frequently, I'm sure that you're all familiar that British Muslims are are compelled to integrate, or they face this call to integrate. And I think that more recently, part of that debate has been shaped by this focus on counter-terrorism, in that if we had more integrated Muslims, we'd have less terrorism. And we believe that's really problematic.
So, as we've already mentioned, we'd like to thank our funders, the Joseph Rowntree Charitable Trust, the Open Society Foundation that actually funded this specific piece of research, all of the respondents of our research. One of the things that we couldn't have done, and actually our entire report is focused solely on themes that came out from our respondents and what they talked about. But we'd also like to thank the research team, Layla Talib and Khalida Ashrafi, who it would just have been impossible to do this without. Fayaz, and aka Gabbar Singh, apparently, who for his technical assistance, he was phenomenal, and Dr. Joanna Gilmore, who took the time really at a very crucial point in her own life to proofread the report and offer amazing suggestions.